You're listening to Sports Connections with David Smale.
So now you told me recently that there was a possibility of competition climbing being included in the Olympics as far back as 1992. So why did it take so long to get approved?
I think that's a really good question. You and I, before we recorded this, we were kind of batting some of these topics back and forth. And I told you, that's the same question that I've wondered for much of my career. And I wish I had a definitive answer. I should preface all this by saying, of course, I was not involved in the discussions between the IOC and all that. This is just all kind of educated guessing on my part. But I have asked that question to various people involved, and the response ends up being something like it's very complicated. But I think there are a couple reasons. First of all, the explanation I tend to get is that it took a long time, decades, for the climbing world and the climbing industry and the climbing federations that wanted it to be an Olympic sport. It took them a long time to change some of the perceptions of the folks at the IOC and kind of convince the IOC that climbing was basically worthy of being included in the Olympics, right? These are the IOC people, most of them were not familiar with climbing. And so there's this perception that it's this extreme sport, right? That's how climbing is sometimes marketed incorrectly, I think. But I think that was the main crux, is that the federations, and specifically the International Climbing Federation, had to convince the IOC that it's not this really dangerous thing. It's not this sport for adrenaline junkies and whatnot. It's actually very athletic and methodical, and assuming it's all done correctly, it's very safe. It took a long time to change those perceptions. And I think something else that coincided with that was if you think back to when climbing was first announced as an Olympic sport, which was in 2016. They announced that it was going to be in the 2020 Olympics. Right. The IOC's announcement specifically said, we want these new sports, including climbing, including skateboarding, including surfing, these new Olympic debut sports, to help us grab the young demographic. They actually specifically cited that. And I think that was just perfect for climbing, because really starting in the late 90s, when climbing really started to get some momentum as a sport, it was really the kids that were driving it, right? The parents would take their kids to the climbing gyms for birthday parties or whatnot. Right. The adults would climb, but the kids would also climb. And I think the climbing industry realized very quickly that if you get the kids, it's the Little League model, right? If you get the kids hooked, you get the parents hooked, potentially you get maybe the kids' siblings hooked, maybe the kids' friends and friends of friends. So the climbing world realized very, very early on that the kids were kind of the way to go for the industry in terms of growth. And it just kind of, as luck would have it, then, a few years later, a decade or so later, when the IOC is starting to think about, what sports could help us kind of grab that young demographic? Well, here was climbing, this sport that already had this robust youth movement and stuff. So I think those were all contributing factors to it.
Yeah, that's a great explanation for somebody who didn't know the reason. You explained it very, very well. It's interesting, though, you talked about new sports and surfing and skateboarding. I mean, I'm 62. I remember skateboarding in the 1960s and thinking, this could be a competitive sport and stuff, not having any idea there'd be skate parks and stuff like that. These aren't new sports. They're just new to the Olympics, and they're gaining popularity, like you said, with the kids, that maybe those of us, my generation and even older, they've been around for a while, but the competition side of it is really catching on with the younger people.
I think that's exactly right. To those people, I'm sure skateboarding has its same sports writers and cohorts that, as sort of the equivalent of what I do in climbing. And I'm sitting here saying, well, it's about time, because we've been wanting to be in the Olympics. And even like you pointed out, if you look back in climbing magazines, even in the late 80s, they're mentioning, this could be a potential Olympic sport someday. So it's not a surprise to those of us that follow these sports, but that doesn't mean it's any less exciting, right? It's still a thrill. It's just kind of felt like it's a long time coming.
Thanks for listening to Sports Connections with David Smale. Make sure to subscribe, follow, and rate the show from your favorite podcast platform. You can learn more about David Smale and his work by visiting davidsmalebooks.com. Don't forget to join us weekly for new episodes. Until next time.